New Order, The Jam, Paul Weller, The Style Council, Aztec Camera, Funboy 3, The Specials, The Cure, Depeche Mode. We became instant friends. He knew more about this brooding genre than even I did. But his greatest influence on me was his hyper-informed and deeply philosophical roots in left-wing politics. Mike, like me, was working as a disinterested student educating himself off curricula. Where I was self-taught by way of news media and pop culture, Mike was informed by the highbrow literary and philosophical tracts of obscure political philosophers. His vocal politics challenged the order that I had long taken for granted. After all, I had no problem with my life. In fact, I liked it a lot. But after years of going to concerts with Mike and going to local coffee shops and visiting alternative bookstores with him, Mike, like a self-appointed mentor, adopted me as a project. And since I was an avowed C+ student and secretly felt I deserved D's, Mike's intellectualism was the epitome of sexy to me. I not only started to read the works of Alan Watts and the ethereal musings of Richard Bach, I also delved into the Utne Reader and LA Weekly, both bastions of leftist thinking. Needless to say, Mike was the exact opposite of my father. He was fascinating. He took the SATs for his friends at his high school. He even wrote papers for them. He got them into the best colleges, and where my father valued hard work above everything, Mike valued intellect above everything. My father had an innate moral compass. Mike had none. But his amoral righteousness was born of a contempt for the existing political and economic paradigms. Except for a self-made ethos of friendship, he reveled in being valueless. Mike gave me a Cliff's Notes version of the leftist point of view, a romanticized, James Deanish, moral relativist, everything is pointless crash course on how thinking people should, in fact, think. I imbibed it without question. So when it came time for college, it was as if the professors in my freshman classes were speaking the exact same language he was. Through some form of osmosis, I considered myself a liberal. As a result, there would be no culture shock when I entered Tulane. While skipping college was never a possibility, my decision-making process for choosing the right one was the exact opposite of all of my peers. To quote the Red Hot Chili Peppers, I wanted to rock out with my cock out. After all, Mike had taught me that nothing mattered anyway. Might as well have fun in the meantime. I put more effort into choosing the correct party school than I did into studying during my entire high school career. And because I had older friends who went to state schools where beer bongs and the frat boy experience were as generic as it appears in the movies, I believed that I had to go to a higher place. I had to up the ante. New Orleans. There happens to be a school there called Tulane. When somebody said to me, "Oh, it's a respectable school," bingo. In one of the more popular college guidebooks, I recall Tulane described in terms of how many bars there were in the surrounding region. It said that you could go to a different bar every night during your time at Tulane and never repeat. That book was not lying. The first 2 weeks of Tulane reminded me of basic training scenes in films where the recruit doesn't seem like he's going to make it. I thought I could drink when I came to Tulane. I had some hard and fast rules to prevent becoming an alcoholic, such as don't drink during sunlight hours. By the end of my time at Tulane, I was going to bed so early in the morning and waking up so late in the afternoon that this rule was almost impossible to break. Thank God I wasn't developing a drinking problem. Now, where I think I made a wrong turn was when I was taken under the wing of a very particular clique in my new fraternity, Delta Tau Delta. These guys were from the Northeast Tri-State area, Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey, and one from California, me. They wrongly assumed from the film portrayal of high school life in the Hollywood of the 1980s, think Less Than Zero, that I was a hard-living, cocaine-fueled man of 1,000 lovers. Perhaps I led them on, because in no time, I was. Any standards I had retained to this point, as well as that little thing I called my virginity, became objects in the rearview mirror very quickly. Not only were my new friends decadent, funny, and sick bastards, there was nothing resembling an adult authority figure in that godforsaken town. Moderation is just not in that city's DNA. On a Tuesday night, for instance, one could find himself at a drinking establishment by the name of F&M on Tchoupitoulas Street, dancing atop a pool table with 20 other denizens of New Orleans, black, white, and Creole, young, middle-aged, and old. Stumbling out of the bar, ready to head on to the next one, a police officer in uniform would stop anyone leaving with a bottle of beer, not to admonish the reveler, but rather to helpfully remind him that he must transfer his beer into a plastic Go cup. I shamefully recall getting behind the wheel of my car with such a Go cup, lifting up the beer and giving an officer a cheer as I drove away, off to the Rendon Inn. Even the law enforcement in New Orleans reinforced the 24/7 debauchery. Truth be told, I was at first horrified by the behavior around me. I do recall at one point musing about my choice of college. This might have been a significant mistake. But because I had my first serious girlfriend on campus, leaving was not an option. So I distinctly chose to do as the Romans did. With the passing of every drunken and debauched week, I could feel the acute sense of right and wrong that had been bestowed upon me by my parents fading further away. I started to see things in shades of gray, and the courses that I was supposedly taking, mostly in the humanities department, seemed to jibe perfectly with this new outlook. One day, I went to my campus mailbox and found a letter that informed me that I was months late in declaring my major. I had been avoiding the decision because not one professor or one class had sufficiently moved me like the young prep school stallions in Dead Poets Society had been. I would have been happy with Rodney Dangerfield from Back to School, but no such luck. So as I walked out of the student union with that letter in hand, I marched up to an attractive group of blonde co-eds with whom I was socially familiar. Part to make them laugh and part to finally make up my mind, I told them that by the end of our conversation, they would decide my major for me. After less than 5 minutes of discussing my academic interests or lack thereof, we decided upon American Studies. What a stud, huh? The virtue of the ambiguous American Studies degree for a creative loafer like me was that it was both an interdisciplinary and an interdepartmental major. I recognized that I could play the different department heads off of each other. To my English professors, I could say, English is not my strong suit. I also found out that this same tactic worked in the history and philosophy departments as well. American Studies etched my wayward trajectory in stone. It ensured I would accomplish nothing in the next few years. The visits back to my Los Angeles reality for Christmas and summer breaks became intrusions into my consciousness. I was becoming a dissolute Southern literary figure without the depth, character development, or literary output. At this point, I was living in two worlds, my LA world and my New Orleans world, my LA friends, my New Orleans friends, my daytime, my nighttime. When I wasn't busy loving my new life, I was horrified and self-loathing. There were only highs and lows. There were no mediums. Around the beginning of my sophomore year, I made yet another excellent lifestyle choice and moved across the way from one of the country's most notorious college bookies. So while my roommates were betting $50 and $100 per game on college football games on Saturday and pro games on Sunday, and of course Monday Night Football, I opted to live vicariously through their wins and losses. For a while. And by a while, I mean about a month. I started to dabble in $20 bets. There was no pizza delivery route in New Orleans, so my money at this point was the $300 monthly stipend my parents were giving me. But as the cliche goes, that $20 wasn't enough action, and so I started getting into the $50 and $100 bets. I started gambling on backgammon, too. I'm not a bad player. This became another means of blowing money that I wasn't earning. But thank God for my accelerating drinking problem, it cut down on the time I had to gamble. My sleep patterns became so irregular that I started to resemble the characters in Anne Rice's New Orleans-based works. The funny thing about sleeping, and this holds true to this day, is that as I would drift into sleep, that's when the harrowing reminders of what my life had become would visit me. I knew that at some point I would have to do an about-face to change everything. But I didn't know how, and to be honest, the cons of this lifestyle had yet to outweigh the pros. My favorite pastime during this 4-year phase was to lure my high school friends down to New Orleans for a weekend, preferably Mardi Gras or Halloween. During those 2 to 3 day forays, I would afford them the trip of a lifetime, showing them things that they couldn't imagine, bewildering them with the euphoria of the 24/7 surreal New Orleans lifestyle. During these benders, I would try to convince myself I was having fun too. But when I would take them to the airport to send them off, where they would thank me for the most spectacularly wild weekend of their lives as they got on the plane, I'd feel the deepest despair. And under my breath I'd say, "Take me with you." Did I mention that I liked a lot of the people that I was at school with? Some were funny. A couple of the ladies even let me be inside of them. So don't get me wrong, my time was not completely misused. It just wasn't productive in any way, shape, or form. And at heart, I knew it. At one critical point in my sophomore year, I went to the head of my department to explain that I was in over my head, and to make matters worse, I had just been dumped by my girlfriend, and she, one of the only ostensible adults in my life in New Orleans, suggested that I take a semester off and go drop acid in New York. She really said that. "Good idea, Teach." So I went. You don't need to hear about it. You can guess. I came back from a semester in New York where I spent $23,500 that I had inherited from a great aunt I didn't really know on nothing. Not to wax too philosophical, but beers in New York are twice as expensive as they are in New Orleans. So with that valuable life lesson, I went back to New Orleans, $23,500 poorer, entering what would have been my junior year with the number of credits an incoming sophomore would have. Now, don't ask me how I did what came next. Even I don't know. But somehow, I made a commitment to myself to graduate with my class. I had no great epiphany. I did not have a transformation that one could see in a montage in a movie where I started to hit the books frantically. I just willed myself to do it. I think it was some atavistic self-preservation. I needed to reach the finish line. I needed to get out of that place. I also vowed to rid myself of this nasty little gambling habit and attendant debt I'd developed. The low point, taking my friend Scott into my walk-in closet, saying he could have whatever he wanted for $50. He took my leather jacket. So one day I called my mother and divulged my bind. In an exceptionally calm manner, she gave me the stern maternal talking to that I desperately needed. She then sent me a check to cover my debt. I paid it, and that was the last of my dealings with my bookie. Moms can do that to you. By now, I knew that graduating was less about getting the degree than it was getting my release papers from New Orleans. Pushing myself through my credit quandary would take more than will. It would take finesse. I hadn't fulfilled my math requirement, mostly because it was the only course that had a mandatory attendance requirement. I had dropped it my first semester, my second semester, and my third semester. At the time, I remember thinking, by the time I'm a senior, I'll have my act together, and I'll pay attention. I know I'll be a better student by my senior year. Yeah, right. So the last semester, I had to take math. If my humanities professors thought I was giving them short shrift, this poor Chinese grad student whose job it was to instill in me the basics of pre-calculus got no shrift. He went shriftless. Going into the final, my last week of class during senior year, I knew less than the day the class started. My test-taking strategy for this, my last test of my woeful college career, was figuring, I'm 22 years old. I've got to know more about this subject than the average 15-year-old high school student. Wrong. The test had 20 questions. As is customary, they required correct answers. And to make matters worse, apparently they wanted me to show my work. After a look through the 20 questions, I noticed that the first was the easiest, and each question was more difficult than the previous one, so that the last was the hardest. After I stared at question 1 for about 15 minutes, hoping that I would be inspired, waiting for the math muse, I realized that today was not going to be my day. I started to see my life passing before my eyes. I started to consider that maybe years of skating by, recklessly expecting everything to work out, had been exactly the wrong approach to derivatives. It was a big moment for someone raised on and among the trusty happy endings of Hollywood. Apparently, I realized, sometimes it doesn't work out. Sometimes you have to make it work out, which means maybe values do matter. I took a deep breath, stood up, walked toward the teacher as the rest of the class scribbled away, and asked that he join me outside the classroom. I said, "Sir, I'm going to be frank with you here. I need to graduate. I have family and friends coming in from out of town tomorrow. We have reservations at Commander's Palace. Failing this class is not going to serve either of our needs. Now, the way I look at it, I'm not going into a career in science or math. I think we can agree upon that. I'm not asking for your answer right now. I just wanted to put this into your head. Perhaps you could see my flawed humanity and allow for me to move on with my life." Even though English was not his first language, he got the message. I called the next day and he gave me a passing grade in the class, a C-, I believe. In the end, I graduated with just above a 2.0. The next day, my parents and family friends, the Solovs, came to celebrate my graduation from Sodom and Gomorrah. At star chef Susan Spicer's Bayona restaurant, delicious. My academic career was toasted. Joanne Solov, my friend Larry's mother, asked me, "So what are you going to do now that you've graduated?" With utter sincerity, I told the table, "Well, over the next year, I'm going to start trying to wake up before noon." The next day was my flight back to Los Angeles, a Delta Airlines nonstop. And back then, they used to give a complimentary USA Today. I remember this because the above-the-fold headline was, "Graduates Entering Worst Economy in Decade." Terrific. Thankfully, with this American Studies degree, I knew I would have a competitive edge. As the plane took off, I envisioned myself like the protagonist in a big-budget Simpson-Bruckheimer film, walking away from an exploding cityscape and not looking backward, not even for a second. From the earliest age, I had always had a profound sense of right and wrong. During college, however, I saw the world through the prism of moral relativism and grays, and my own personal standards simply went away somewhere. Okay, fair enough. I was young. But now I needed them back. I didn't consider this political, nor did I see this as theological. It was just my internal voice telling me I had to straighten up. Who knows where it came from? My parents, my solid upbringing, I'd guess. Perhaps coming back to Los Angeles, where my family and friends lived, I felt that I needed to return to the Andrew Breitbart that these people expected. In addition to that, my parents did what they probably should have done as I entered college. They cut me off financially. It's hard to explain to the average person what upper-middle-class entitlement feels like, because when you no longer have it and you recognize how pathetic it is, it becomes a point of embarrassment. My work ethic in high school provided me goodies, the extras of life. Now I needed money to live, so I got a job waiting tables at Hal's in Venice. When I got my first paycheck, when I got my first day's worth of tips while waiting at Hal's, and I had to apply that to rent, to shoes, to rice, to the basic necessities of life, I was in shock. How on God's green earth did everybody do this? But buying my first pair of shoes with my own money was an Emersonian epiphany. That was one of the first baby steps toward embracing adulthood and maturity, something that being on the easy parental dole could never provide. I felt like Andrew Carnegie in those shoes. A second step toward self-actualization was the experience of waiting tables on friends from high school and college who happened in on my lowly afternoon wait shift. Twice, friends asked me with a look of great worry on their faces, "Why are you doing this?" The peer pressure that had defined so much of my high school years in Brentwood and the mostly wealthy clique that I spent time with at Tulane meant that if I joined the club, I would be a member of the elite. To fall outside of the boundaries of that upper-middle classness wasn't merely unacceptable, it simply wasn't an option. And here I was, waiting on my former peers hand and foot. I'd spent many years in Brentwood and at Tulane scoffing at my friends who fretted about their futures. Now here I was, watching those same people in law school, medical school, or working in jobs in buildings that I didn't even know how to enter. Nothing like a dose of complete humiliation to make you realize how completely full of shit you are. But strangely, it felt good. I knew the only place to go was up. Instead of being deflated by the realization that my friends had the answers and had figured out how to get respectable jobs right out of college, I was just happy with the expectation that somebody was waiting for me to do a job. Baby steps, I told myself. My years in New Orleans began to appear more and more ludicrous to me. I'd thought I was some sort of standard bearer, stumbling home at daylight every morning. It felt significantly less maverick to be informing my childhood friends what the soup of the day was. I was beginning to understand that my self-worth was in direct proportion to how hard I applied myself to productive pursuits. My values were returning from exile. Even as I was discovering the fulfillment I could derive from hard work, I was still a default liberal. Around this time, I watched the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings with the alacrity of a boxing fan at the Ali Frazier fight. It was a major media event and a political heavyweight match. The way that the media had billed it, the Rocky Balboa was Anita Hill. She was the protagonist. The only people in Clarence Thomas's corner were members of the Republican Party, and to me, they were the scolds, the hypocrites, the town elders in Footloose, the people who represented the people who would give over their hard-earned money to Jim and Tammy Baker in exchange for eternal salvation. My perspective on the political process was an inch deep, but my desire to see Clarence Thomas's blood was immense. So when the opening bell rang, I was expecting Hill to deliver a relentless barrage of accusations and evidence about a man whose behavior around women was professionally unacceptable. I expected lurid details of intimidation, coercion, and harassment. But Hill and her allies described a workplace and a boss-employee relationship that seemed utterly unremarkable. To listen to the media commentators affirm the outrage of Democratic female harpies, parroting the overwrought cries of Anita as channeled by this driven core of Democratic officials, was infuriating. It was so obviously unjust. Leading the questioning, by the way, Senators Howard Metzenbaum, Pat Leahy, Joe Biden, and Teddy Kennedy. Now, I may have been a Democrat. I may have been a liberal, but I was not stupid. Something was very wrong here. The melodrama did not come close to matching the lack of evidence that was being presented. They were accusing Thomas of spotting a pubic hair on a soda can, of asking Hill on a date. There was no there. It was ridiculous. I was perfectly aware at the time that the Democrats were motivated by the abortion issue, and at the time I was pro-choice. So when Thomas's inquisitors pierced the sanctity of the right to privacy that is the hallmark of left-wing constitutional rights, flaunting that they had discovered through illicit means that Thomas had rented pornography, my mental anguish turned physical. I writhed in agony and actually threw a shoe at the television set. At the same time, it was impossible for me to not recognize that Clarence Thomas's being black was part of the story. How in hell could white Americans Leahy, Biden, and Metzenbaum, let alone former KKK Grand Poobah Robert Byrd and Chappaquiddick's very own Ted Kennedy, so arrogantly excoriate this man whose personal narrative from sharecropper's grandson to Supreme Court nominee embodied the American dream. A narrative that would send a clear signal to African Americans that anything is possible in this country. Why were so many white Democrats in the media and in the political class working in concert to assassinate this man's character and to stop that dream in its tracks? During this media feeding frenzy, my eyes were opened, perhaps for the first time, to the fact that something was awry in American political and media life. What secret bit did Kennedy and Biden know about the NAACP, ABC, NBC, and CBS that they could grill a black man on such weak charges and know that those politically correct entities would not savage them? If the tables were turned and Clarence Thomas were a liberal Democrat, the NAACP wouldn't have waited a second. Somehow these white male senators of privilege knew that they could get away with it. My sympathy for Thomas was utter and complete. I wanted to stop the hearings. I wanted him to be issued public, formal apologies. I naively expected that the press would do the job of forcing those apologies. I could understand how the mainstream media could accept Anita Hill and Congresswoman Pat Schroeder at their word. But even if the accusations were true, they amounted to nothing. Certainly a hell of a lot less than what Senator Kennedy likely did to his female staff on any given Washington workday. This was, as Clarence Thomas perfectly stated, an electronic lynching. And the media aided and abetted it. Please note that I did not leave the Clarence Thomas hearings a Republican. I did not leave the hearings an originalist. But I did leave the hearings deeply cynical of media that I had thought were neutral, and a Democratic Party that I'd believe was guided by principle. This was the beginning of the end of the self-deception that I was like everyone else around me. It would take a few more years to get there, to discover that I was a conservative, but this was the exact point where I realized that it was not just that I disagreed with the Democratic Party, but, more important, that the media were its dominant partner in crime. The national disgrace that was the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings, for me, changed everything. This is not the point in the story where we cue the montage of success. Based on the available evidence that the only tangible skill set I had was that I could make people laugh and that I was in Los Angeles, I took the first available job in Hollywood with the hope that I'd eventually become a comedy writer. Hollywood is anything but a meritocracy. So I thought I'd try to leverage some old friends to insert myself into the world that was the backdrop of my childhood. Through a friend, I got a runner position at a low-budget movie production company in Santa Monica. Over a period of a year, I put 22,000 miles on the Saab convertible that I'd bought when I graduated college. Its quality was a constant and painful reminder that I hadn't earned the money for it. But in the exceptionally shallow town that is Hollywood, my boss took an immediate liking to me based on his false perception that I was of his status. With the $230 that he was paying me per week, I couldn't afford my own car payments, let alone running around with his Hollywood crowd. But I learned that that was exactly what I had to do in order to get ahead in that business. For a year, I delivered scripts around town, entering every single Hollywood office of note, including Michael Ovitz's, Jeffrey Katzenberg's, and Michael Eisner's. It wasn't long before I saw clearly what made Hollywood run. I realized that the town was about relationships, about ass-kissing, about groupthink, about looking over the shoulder of the person you're having a conversation with to see if there's somebody more important in the room that you should be speaking to. I just as quickly realized that this was not my world. I had spent the last 4 years of my life in college subordinating myself to a system that ran against my better instincts. I was not going to make that mistake again. So while the producer was incentivizing me to become production staff, he even gave me control over a project, Valley Girl 2, thank God that was never made. I did everything in my power to stay in my car doing the lowly runner job because I didn't want to get sucked in further. And in my car was AM radio. My habit came about accidentally. My devotion to K-Rock FM and San Diego's 91X, trailblazing alternative rock stations, began to fade with the invasion of the grunge rock movement.